Almirante Durante, director general de Educación de la Marina, señor general de Brigada del Ejército Peruano del Ejército del Perú, quien, director de la Escuela Superior de Guerra del Ejército, señor Coronel Barrick, director del Juego de Guerra de la Marine Corps University, estimados oficiales superiores y subalternos, también planta docente de la Escuela Superior de Guerra Naval, de la Escuela Superior de Guerra del Ejército y del Centro de Entrenamiento Táctico Naval. El que les habla es el contraalmirante del Capio Sala, director de la Escuela Superior de Guerra Naval. Nuestra misión es preparar a los oficiales de la Marina en Guerra del Perú, pero también tenemos dentro de nuestro grupo de alumnos oficiales de la Fuerza Aérea del Perú, del Ejército del Perú y de la Policía Nacional. También contamos con la presencia de un oficial de la Armada Argentina, que está acá presente. Cada año nos dedicamos a preparar en educación militar a oficiales de diferentes grados, empezando desde grado de teniente segundo, teniente primero, capitanes de corbeta hasta capitanes de navío y coroneles. Una de las bases o el principio fundamental de la existencia de nuestras escuelas superiores de guerra, tanto del Ejército, la Fuerza Aérea y de la Marina, es enseñar los conceptos de planeamiento y guerra y los conceptos de juegos de guerra. Y es por eso que estamos aquí convocados. El año pasado creo que hemos dado un gran avance adelante. Hemos podido organizar el primer simposio de juegos de guerra, que duró 3 días acá, y tuvimos la oportunidad de contar con el coronel Barrick virtualmente, porque no pudo venir, pero quedó pendiente y la visita se ha hecho realidad el día de ayer. Iba a estar con nosotros hasta el día viernes. Thank you very much, Coronel, because you participated last year in our symposium virtually, but we are very happy to receive you here in Lima, in person. Thank you very much for your support last year. Your presentation provided us a very good view and understanding of wargaming in the military education. And today we have here in this auditorium officers from the Navy, Air Force, Army, and the police, the Peruvian police. Also part of the professors of some military education centers and also the tactical center. So we appreciate your presence here and the auditorium is yours. Un aplauso para el coronel.
Thank you, Admiral Docaprio. Thank you for the invitation to present to you today on wargaming. Good morning, admirals and generals, and to the audience. So truly a pleasure. I was telling the Admiral, this is my first time in Peru and first time in South America. I've traveled a lot of the world, but never in South America, so truly a pleasure to be here today. I want to extend greetings from Marine Corps University, and Admiral, I appreciate your passion for wargaming, and it is great to see someone that shares the passion for wargaming and the power that it can have in shaping military decision-making and warfighting concepts. So this morning, I hope to present to you and help convey what wargaming can do and some of the opportunities that wargaming presents, also some of the challenges. I'm going to talk about Wargaming 101, a very basic presentation, but you'll note the 201, I am going to get into some advanced concepts. So I will cover the foundation first, and then we'll start to get into some advanced concepts related to wargaming and running wargaming events. What you see in the pictures here is a progression of generations of wargaming. And you can see some of the history, and as the Admiral's been explaining to me, some of your your history here on this campus with wargaming is very similar, with wargaming on the floor, with balconies, much like the Naval War College back in the 1920s and the 1930s, progressing to computer-supported games, and as we look to the future with artificial intelligence, that is something that today is being looked at very closely, is what is the future of wargaming as artificial intelligence matures, and how do military professionals leverage war games with computers, with tabletop, and for different purposes. As part of my background, I've been responsible for wargaming for future force development, future concepts. I was at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab as the wargaming director, and we did war games looking at future warfighting concepts and force design. Now, my current job, I am focused on war games for education, military education, two very different purposes, but a lot of commonality, and I'll talk about some of that as I present. I'll grab the laser pointer. If you could go to the next slide, please. So the agenda, we're going to talk about wargaming. I'm going to get into why wargaming and how. Then we'll talk about different wargaming methods. I will then spend some time talking about the Operational Wargame System. I'm the lead designer for the Operational Wargame System. I will explain to you the basics of what it is. And then we will wrap up with how to run a wargame event, and I'll give you some examples. Next slide. Next slide. So first on wargaming. As mentioned, wargaming can be done for multiple purposes. First off, force development. Militaries have to understand what is their role in national defense. What is a warfighting concept? How do you fight, or what threats might you face in the future, and how do you fight against those threats? Those are related to what is the mission, what mission must you execute, what is the role of the force, and then how might you accomplish that. That also relates to what is the threat. What threat do you need to wargame against, or what threat capabilities? That helps to inform future warfighting concepts and force design. What ships do you need in the future? How many ships? What kinds of aircraft? What kinds of missiles? How big of an army do you need to have? These are questions that wargaming can help inform. Then in the middle, military education. What are the principles of war, and how do you fight? What is the war fighting in the mind of the commander? This gets to art of war, it gets to science of war, and from an education standpoint, we want to teach the skills of warfighting. And wargaming is a key tool. It's not the only tool, but it is a key tool to helping educate the mind of the warfighter. Then we get to operational units. We have operational units that are also wargaming to refine their plans. When you are in charge of a ship or a unit, you want to understand how to fight, how to employ your force within a plan, a contingency plan, or if you are in war already, what you want to wargame your operation, your concept of operation. So as you can see, there are multiple purposes to wargaming in terms of who is wargaming and why. There are different purposes, but wargaming can help in all of these areas. Next slide, please. I always like to start with why. Why working? And I want to focus on that bullet point number 1 about adaptive behavior. In 1977, DARPA, which is a United States research organization, conducted a study of infantry battalions that fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Their research question was what made some infantry battalions better in combat than others. And one of the key things that they found was those battalions that demonstrated adaptive behavior performed better in combat than those that did not. So what does that mean? What does this adaptive behavior really mean? You have probably heard the saying that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Why is that? That's because when you plan based on assumptions. You have to make assumptions about the situation, about the threat, and you form your plan based on those assumptions. Now, when you execute your plan, the enemy may not cooperate and may change the conditions that you're operating in. So the question about adaptive behavior is how long does it take that staff and that commander to recognize that the assumptions they made in planning are not valid for the situation that they're in. The situation changed. Are they adaptive where they can recognize the situation is different, I need to change my plan? Or are they stuck on their plan and they're just trying to execute their plan and they don't have the mental agility to recognize that they need to change their plan because the situation that they're in is different? That's what they mean by adaptive behavior. Those battalions that could recognize the situation they're in is different from the situation that they planned for and adapted their plan on the fly, those battalions were more successful in combat than those that were locked into one way of thinking in just trying to execute their plan. So as an educator, the question then is, how do you cultivate adaptive behavior? How do you educate adaptive behavior? And that's a challenge. I believe that wargaming is one of the only ways that you can effectively develop adaptive behavior because you can challenge people with decision making and a changing environment with a thinking enemy. You can challenge them with that in wargaming and condition them to recognize that no plan is going to survive contact and they have to be ready to adjust their plan. So to me, this is the number one reason of why we wargame, is to cultivate adaptive behavior. Number 2, mental models. When you make decisions based on a mental model that is in your mind that helps you understand the problem and devise a solution. We do this based on our experiences and our education. And if you are confronted with something for the first time, then you may not have a mental model that helps you understand the problem or understand the threat. This is a really important part of wargaming, that if you wargame many different ways to look at a problem, you might get it right and have the mental model that if you face that same problem in war, you have a mental model that helps you quickly understand and quickly devise a solution. If you don't wargame, how do you develop the mental models for a future war? If let's just say hypothetically, there were a war between the United States and China in the future, hypothetically. How do I understand, or how can I understand the problems that we might face if we don't wargame that kind of problem? Every military has to do this with hypothetical threats, hypothetical circumstances, so that you can cultivate those mental models in your mind. The risk of surprise. So there's a famous saying by Admiral Nimitz that in World War II, nothing that happened in the Pacific was a surprise to the U.S. military, except for the kamikazes. That was the one thing that the military did not think about and wargame against, was the kamikaze threat. But everything else, they had wargamed, and therefore they were not surprised, and they were able to quickly make decisions. That's what this number 2 is talking about, is wargaming helps you develop mental models. Now let's talk number 3. And by the way, I'm spending the most time on this slide, okay? Because I think this is the foundation that you have to understand is why wargame, what is the value, what's the benefit. So number 3, to know tactics, you must know weapons. How do you effectively neutralize the adversary, mitigate the threat of their weapons? How can you devise tactics if you don't know the weapons? You can't. You have to know what weapons an adversary is going to employ, and you have to know your own weapons. How effective are your weapons in defense versus your enemy's weapons that they're going to attack you with? And what is the interaction? If you don't know weapon systems, you can't properly craft tactics. This is a huge problem today because there are so many weapon systems in today's battlefield that you have to understand. This gets to the concept of all-domain warfare. And most of us are experts in one domain. Might be the land domain for the Army, might be the naval domain for the Navy, the air domain for the Air Force. But I come across very few people who understand all domains, especially now adding space, cyber capabilities. When we wargame at Marine Corps University, I will quite often have officers pick up a missile or a weapon system from the game board and ask the question, what is this? It's their first time seeing it. And sometimes that's a shock to me because they're systems that they should know. They're either blue force systems that are friendly that they should know, or it's a threat system they should know. But this is the challenge of today's environment with its complexity, is there's so much to learn. I've been wargaming for a long time, and I've been looking at the future force and future conflicts for a long time. I learn every day. I never run out of things to learn because it's impossible to get your mind around all of it. So this is the challenge, is how do you prepare yourself for a future fight when it is extremely complex? The only way to really learn it is to do it. But you can't fight with real systems in peacetime. So the only way to get that experience is through a virtual experience on a tabletop or in a computer game, that helps you learn the weapon systems and the tactics. And I particularly talk about risk. The risk decision that a commander makes is one of the most important decisions that a commander is responsible for. When you are charged with a mission as a commander, do you understand the risks that your force is going to be exposed to accomplish that mission? That's a fundamental question that every commander must wrestle with, is risk to mission, risk to force. And this is that risk calculus decision that is the realm of a commander. And does that commander know how much risk he is taking, or she, when they are giving missions to they're giving tasks to their units? Do they know the risk that they're putting on that unit? That it's high risk, low risk, medium risk? You need to know the weapon systems if you are going to properly form that risk calculus decision as a commander. So, number 4, wargaming is sticky. What does this mean? It's active learning. This is the way we will burn onto our mind the weapon systems, the tactics, the risks, the concepts. You learn it by doing it. And wargaming, especially when it's against a human opponent, where your reputational stake is on the line, you become emotionally invested. And when you are emotionally invested, that is when you really start to remember and learn the concepts that you're immersed in. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, the DARPA, I'm going to revert back to the DARPA study. This is the quote from the report from that DARPA study that talked about adaptive behavior. I'll give you a moment to read this quote. Adaptive behavior, the ability to recognize a situation and react, is central. Okay? The more we can show students, military professionals, different situations, they start to recognize patterns that help inform the mental models. Next slide, please. So this gets to the concept of the cognitive competencies of warfighting. What are those mental skills that are needed to be a commander, to be a decision maker? You have certain mental processes and skills that you must possess, and you need to cultivate that. These are different wargame tools. This quote is from a Marine Corps doctrinal publication on learning. Marines develop an intellectual edge by learning cognitive skills and competencies that enable them to move through the observe, orient, decide, act. This is the OODA loop that many of you have probably heard about. Referred to as the OODA loop more quickly and effectively than the enemy. These are some of those mental skills: problem framing, mental imaging, risk assessment, decision making, adaptation. So this, from an education standpoint, is that critical goal of wargaming. Next slide. So how do you wargame? I'm going to go fairly quickly through this slide We can come back to this in the question and discussion if you want. But when you're running a war game, it's about player decision making. How many decisions is a player required to make? This is a challenge sometimes with war games where we spend too much time on game mechanics and not enough time making decisions. So this is an evaluation criteria that is useful when you're looking at a war game and thinking about what decisions are the players making and how often are they making those decisions. Time. How do you spend time in the game? I will quite often devote a lot of time to planning because this is about helping that player formulate their ideas and decisions and then putting them in a situation in the game where they have an opportunity to really think about the problem and think about solutions. And of course, the last is linking the game to the learning outcome. This could be tactical, understanding a specific weapon system and how to employ just one weapon system. It could be about logistics. It could be about intelligence and reconnaissance. There are lots of different learning outcomes that from a school curriculum standpoint, you may be trying to achieve with a war game. And you have to design that game scenario to meet your desired learning outcome. Next slide. All right, so how do you war game? Just to summarize, cultivating adaptive behavior, you have to have fog of war. You cannot give perfect intelligence to the players. There needs to be some uncertainty about the threat, about what the threat will do, and about the situation when they're planning. Don't plan with perfect intelligence. Plan with uncertainty. Understand the threat. Decide what threat systems you want your players to understand and be challenged with, and include that in the game. All-domain warfare. It's a complex battlefield, and our war game scenarios today need to include all aspects of warfare to help challenge players with all-domain combined arms. Now, when you're running a game, there is an art to facilitation. The speed that you run the game, the adjudication process, are you rigid, are you not rigid, and I'll get into some of that. There is art to facilitation. Not everybody can do it, but it is something that is really important to a game, is that after-action process and the facilitation. Next slide. Go ahead and hit the next one. All right, so I'm going to shift to the next part of this presentation, which is on wargaming methods. On the left, you have computers. Computers are rigid in their adjudication. They have to follow a logic that tells them, here's what happens. There is no middle ground. Computers, it is either a 1 or a 0. It has to decide. So it is a rigid adjudication. You're locked into a turn sequence and methods with computers. That can be good. That can be a challenge. On the right, you have a seminar war game. This is where we might have a conversation. I might ask this side of the room, what do you think the outcome of a specific engagement is? Let's just say it's an air-to-air engagement. What is the probability of success of one aircraft and missile versus another? You may have an opinion. Then I go to this side of the room. What is your assessment of the probability of success? And why? What factors? Weather, range, the seeker head on the missile, the sensors on the aircraft, the pilot skills. There are a lot of factors that go into the outcome of any engagement. And the value of a seminar game is we force the players to think about those factors. If we put that on a computer, we're going to have an air-to-air engagement, and the computer tells us what happened. What do the players learn? What do they learn about what factors went into the algorithm that the computer used? It's challenging for players to see that. So that is one of the risks of computer simulation, is that the players don't see why the outcome is what it is. In a matrix seminar game, you put that entirely on the humans. Now, humans make mistakes, and humans may not think about all the factors. Or you might be doing a game where you have submarine operations, and nobody in the room is a submarine expert. Now how do you adjudicate? That gets to the middle. Tabletop game with a rule book-based adjudication that is semi-rigid. And when I talk about the operational wargame system, that's what it is. It's a semi-rigid adjudication. It provides a framework on how to adjudicate when you may not have the right expert in the room. And it gives you consistency in that adjudication. But there's always room to revert to this. It's impossible for a game to anticipate every situation and every problem. So there's value in semi-rigid adjudication with a tabletop because you can be flexible in that adjudication. What I advise people is when you don't understand a problem, it's better to be over here. Because when you need to understand it, a matrix game is going to help you wrestle with what factors go into that problem. When you do understand the problem, but your goal is to look at a lot of different possible solutions, a computer game might be the better way to do it. It's faster, it gives you data output, and you can run multiple courses of action through a computer, and then it'll give you the results. So, I tell people I'm an equal opportunity wargamer. I think there are times when you want the computer simulation, there are times when you want the human adjudication, and there are times when you want the middle ground that is very flexible. So there are lots of different wargame methods. None of them are perfect, and you have to adapt the game and your method to meet the purpose of your game and why you're running. Next slide. So I'm going to give you some examples of some games. This is a commercial simulation that's called Command Modern Operations. This is one of the tools that we use at Marine Corps University that gives us that computer simulation. It's very high fidelity, lots of detail in this, and you can do real time, you can speed the gameplay. This is an example of a scenario from our Command and Staff College, Pacific Challenge. We have a fictional threat that is a fictional country called Indo-Asia that is on the island of Sumatra, and we're fighting a hypothetical situation And this is an example from that game. Very, very big joint task force scenario. Next slide. This is an example from our Expeditionary Warfare School, which is our captain's course, using command. This is a more tactical scenario with an amphibious landing, about a Marine Expeditionary Unit, battalion-size scenario, and we have used command to help model this problem. Next slide. This is the operational wargame system, tabletop. Some of you may have seen this because I know the Admiral has integrated the operational wargame system here to some degree. This is an example of students using the operational wargame system for a Taiwan scenario, and you can see we have the tabletop and the digital format, and the students are deep in thought. Next slide. This is the operational wargame system with a Ukraine scenario. We ran this game about 2 years ago, shortly after the war started, to look at what does the future hold for this conflict. We wrote about it in some articles from Modern War Institute, also War on the Rocks, two articles published on our wargaming effort for Ukraine, looking at that war and trying to understand where it might go in the future. I would just encourage you to read our article that we wrote 2 years ago about wargaming along war. It's called Wargaming Along War. And if you read that and you assess the situation today, I think what you will find is that it's very close. It's about attrition, about force generation, and which side is able to generate forces, munitions, and that there is very limited ability for one side to gain a decisive advantage over the other, and that it's an attrition war. That was 2 years ago, and the war has unfolded in much the same way. And it was through the war game, this war game right here, that we gained a lot of those insights as we war gamed that problem. Next slide. We kept the map for that game up for a long time, keeping pace with the war. We don't have that up anymore, but we still have this game system. The orders of battle have changed dramatically, as much of the starting force in that conflict has suffered attrition, and new units have been built. We have not kept pace. It's been a challenge from an open source information to keep pace with the conflict. But we still have the game system, it is still useful, and we have run some scenarios still. Next slide. Okay, let me talk computer game. So, multiple reps and sets. When you go to the gym and work out, you want to get multiple reps and sets to condition your body. It's the same thing with wargaming. You want to get multiple reps and sets with war games, looking at different problems, different situations, devising different solutions, facing different opponents. Some opponents are easy to beat. Some are very difficult. I can tell you that when I play somebody in one of our tournaments, we run computer tournaments. We have a wargaming cloud that we run commercial games. You can see some of them here. War plan, strategic command. We have company level. Some of these are modern. Some are historical. But we run tournaments And I can tell you within the first 2 turns whether I'm going to be in trouble or not versus my opponent. I know very quickly whether they are good in their tactics or whether their tactics are poor. And I can tell that within either the first turn and certainly by the second turn. I can see it in my opponent. I don't even have to talk to them. I can just see what they're doing with their forces to know whether or not they know what they're doing. And we run these on a recurring basis, trying to create an environment where you're free to fail. It's better to fail in a game now, in peacetime, making decisions and learning from those decisions, than it is to not make tactical decisions or strategic decisions at all. And then when you're in a conflict, suddenly for the first time, you're challenged with making decisions. We want our officers and enlisted making decisions with multiple reps and sets to build those mental models to help them more rapidly make decisions and devise solutions. Next slide. This is an example. We have a software tool that is the Hex War Management System that allows us to keep track of our player data, their scenarios, their win-loss record. We have leaderboards. This is in development. We've invested in after-action tools to be integrated into this to help us make this better, make instruction better. We're not there yet. This is still prototype, but we're working on this to help us create this digital warfighting arena that allows us to get multiple reps and sets. Next slide. All right, let me talk about the operational wargame system. Next slide. Okay, this system is focused on joint warfighting and the operational level of war. And it can be run at the tactical level with ship versus ship. And it's very effective in doing that. So scalable from tactical to operational. Some of you are going to be participating this week in some training in this game system that we'll do over the next few days. There are multiple game modules. Assassin's Maze focuses on a hypothetical war in the Pacific between the US and China. Taiwan looks specifically at Eastern Theater Command for China and Taiwan and what an amphibious operations scenario might look like. War on the Steppes, this is the Ukraine game I talked about. And Griffin's Mace is war in Europe, which is between Russia and NATO. And then there are multiple small box expansions from Iran. Desert Vanguard is for Middle East, Southeast Asia, 7th Fleet, Baltic Blitz, Baltic Storm. The value of this is a common game system with different scenarios from all over the world. This game system has been in development for 5 years, and we've continually added new orders to battle, new scenarios, new maps to the game system so that we can war game just about any scenario. We don't have Korea yet, but that's in the plan to get Korea added. So it's continuing to evolve, and this game system is being used extensively in the United States and with allies and partners. Next slide. I won't get into the learning objectives here. These are some of the learning objectives that the game specifically enables. I mentioned the risk calculus decision, 21st century combined arms, the challenges of distance, the precision strike regime that characterizes today's battlefield. These are all things that the game system helps enable. Next slide. The next few slides talk about some of the specific modules. These are just a snapshot of the order of battle and some of the scenarios that are included in this game. This is Assassin's Mace. Note the Chinese ships, bombers, 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force, 7th Fleet, Australia, Japan, and we have other orders of battle for Asia in this game system as well. Next one. Taiwan forces, maps, various maps for the game. Next one. Ukraine. Most of the Russian order of battle down to the battalion level is included in two game boxes. Next one. And Griffin's Mace for NATO, Russia. This is brigade level. Next one. These are different organizations that use the operational wargame system. As you can tell, there's a lot of different organizations using this game system. It has really taken off a lot in the last few years. Next slide. All right, this is the last section. I'm going to go through this very quickly, and then we'll get to some questions and discussion that you may have. All right, next slide. All right, this is a framework for a concept game using command modern operations computer game. When you're designing a game and you have specific research questions, first, what is your problem? What are the research questions you're trying to inform? What capabilities must you include in the game to help you answer the questions? So you can see there's a design logic here that really follows a scientific method of structuring your research to help answer your questions and using the game as a research method to support analysis. And you have to make sure that your data in the game, either unclassified or classified, your data about aircraft, missiles, ships, what data values are you including in the game? These are really important things to get dialed in to help you get the game structured to help answer your questions. Next slide. What portion of a conflict do you want to look at? Are you looking at the road to war? Are you looking at posturing forces for action? Is it a mobilization timeline that is something that you need to explore? Is it shaping actions? Is it decisive action? Or is it all of this? So, as you think about running a scenario or wargame event, one of my first questions is, what year? What year are we talking about? Because that informs what weapon systems you include, what order of battle you include. If we're running a game that is today a fight tonight scenario, that may be very different from a game that is 10 years from now in the weapon systems that may be on your ships, your composition of your army, what aircraft and missiles your Air Force has, what year you're fighting a game scenario makes a huge difference. That's one of the first questions I ask. And then, what portion of the conflict do we want to look at? The early stages, is it a deterrence game, and we're trying to deter conflict, and we want to answer research questions about how do we use military power to deter a conflict without provoking a conflict. Because quite often in a game scenario, that's what I see happen. Players will position forces to deter, but the opposing side perceives that as an escalation and a provocation. So we get some really interesting insights into the difference between one side's intent and the perception of what that looks like in the opposing side. Or do you need to look at the conflict itself? So where are you in the framework of your scenario is an important question. Next slide. Time. This is one of the other key questions I ask. How much time do we have for the game? What that tells me as a game designer is how much time I can grant the players for planning to help them orient on the problem and devise solutions. And then what is my turn duration? Do I want to get through a year of conflict? Then my turns might have to be 6-month turns or 3-month turns. That Ukraine game I talked about, one of them, we tried to forecast 2 years into the future, and that required us to run turns that were 3 months long, very abstract. Many games that I've run were at a very tactical level where the turn is 1 day, and we're wargaming the opening days of a conflict. But it takes time to adjudicate that detail. So how much time does one turn expend in the game, and how much time do you have to run the game to enable the players to plan? Next slide. Player roles. How many players, and then what level of decision do you want them making in the game? Do you want them at the ship captain level, the fleet commander level, the theater level? Where do you want them making decisions? And then assign those roles accordingly. What you see here are functional, maneuver, fires, ISR, air, cyber, logistics. This is a single staff. And then supporting unit planners. I've also run games where a player is the air component commander. Another player is the maritime component. Another player is the land component. Another is the joint task force commander. So what decisions do you want the players making? What organizations are fighting in the game? And make those assignments accordingly. Next slide. This is an example of how we've used command, the computer game, to support war games. Different methods. We've run it with one game cell, with 4 to 8 players inputting a plan into the game. We've run that same model where we have 3 different games running in parallel. So we get 3 different outputs that we can compare at the end of the game. And then we've run it with force-on-force multiplayer to really dive into the decision-making and dynamic interaction. Next slide. And this is an example of what a game room might look like, where you have a planning table. You might have blue cell, red cell, green cell, white cell, different computers, and you may be playing a computer game where the map table simply helps you plan, or this might be where you're doing planning on the computers, but the game is being run on the table. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Next slide. And this is where we transition to questions and discussions. So So really what I've covered here is the basics on why I'm working and how. Talked about different methodology for wargaming, from computer to tabletop to seminar, matrix games. Talked about the operational wargame system, and then I talked about some of the key design decisions. If you're running a wargame event, some of those decisions of how you put together a wargame event, and that was really my intent here for this session. So what I'd like to do is, I believe we have some time, I think potentially 20, 30 minutes if we need to, for questions, discussion. So open it up to any questions from the audience. Sir.
Sir, Captain Ryan is here. Thank you very much for your presentation. From another Marine, it was very interesting. I actually have two questions, sir. The first one is related to the predictive nature of wargaming. You've mentioned that you had an article, or you presented an article about Ukraine. Where's the article? Because it would be really interesting to read that. And the second question is, from all the whys that you have explained, do you agree, or maybe that's what I understood, do you agree that predictive behavior or adaptive behavior is the best feature?
Yeah, can you repeat your first question again?
Oh, the first question, yes. You mentioned about an article about Ukraine. Where can we find it? Because that would be interesting to read.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
The article about Ukraine, sir. There was an article.
Article.
Yes.
Yes. Sorry about that. So the articles on Ukraine, one is in War on the Rocks, and it's called The Wargame Before the War. And if you look up my last name, Barrick, you should be able to find that with Ukraine and War on the Rocks. That game was run just before the war started. And it was a very tactical game, looking at the first few days of how a Russian offensive might unfold. The second article is called Wargaming, A Long War. And that is from Modern War Institute. And that one looked at an 18-month to 2-year projection on Ukraine. And then your second question related to adaptive behavior or predictive behavior, right? And what's an important caution about war games is I've seen too often that people will play a game and then they think they have it figured out of, okay, I played that game, this is what happens. I'm guilty of it. Many people that play games are guilty of it, where when you run a game, you think now, because you've experienced that game, that that's how it will unfold. That's a dangerous assumption, right? Because in the end, we are going to get the game wrong in some way, right? Real life is much more dynamic and complex. A game is simplified. And we have abstracted aspects of conflict where it's impossible to model the real world, right? So we have to be very careful about saying, hey, we got this right. Now, this is something that's interesting about Ukraine happening right now, because I've wargamed the Ukraine conflict. I see some things that are similar to what we saw in the game. But I also see what we get wrong in the game, right? Because we can look at the conflict and then ask the question, does this game model what we're seeing? I'll give you an example of two things that we got wrong when we did the first Ukraine war game before it started. In our game that we played, Russia achieves air superiority after like 2 days. We assumed a degree of lethality versus air defense, and that the air defense systems were neutralized, and that the Ukrainian Air Force was destroyed within the first few days of the conflict. We clearly got that wrong, right? And then the important question is why? And what is it in the game system that we need to change our model, right? The model is wrong that generated this outcome. Why is it wrong? And how must we adapt it? The other thing that we got wrong is human factors. So, I mean, I designed the counters for the game. And I took a tank battalion for Russia and made it equal with a tank battalion in Ukraine. It was basically the same equipment. Same thing with the mechanized formation. They're using BTRs, BMPs, T-72s, T-64s, you know, not now, but back then, the equipment was very similar. And I gave the attack values and defense values were basically the same for Ukrainian units and Russian units, right? Based on equipment, not human factors. So what we have clearly seen is that Ukraine fought with very high will to fight, tenacity, creativity, and a resolve that was not mirrored by the Russian formations. So how do you account for the human differences in the game? So since then, I've started to apply different values. For example, I may have a brigade where there's 3 battalions, all with the same equipment. But I will make one battalion better than the others. To model, we've all seen you have that one ship or that one battalion that has better leadership, better training, and it may be just the number of people. In the Marine Corps, we have some units, when they come off of a deployment, they lose people, and then they have to be repopulated, rebuilt with new Marines coming out of school. So they're at a lower readiness than a battalion that is about to go on deployment, has all their people, has been through the training. They are in a much higher state of readiness than this other battalion. So the human factors is one that is, it's hard to get right, and it's something that is a really important aspect of game design, is to really make that assessment on the human factors. One more comment on this. Doctrine. So one of the challenges, doctrine and organization. So one of the challenges with Ukraine is they did not have a division organization. And when you talk about fires employment and using artillery battalions, how effective are they at integrating fires and combined arms into their combat? They're very good at the platoon level, very, very good at the company level, and the higher you go to battalion, brigade, and higher, they don't have the same kind of training background and organization and procedures that, for example, in the U.S. military, that we have at the higher levels. So from a game standpoint, how many artillery battalions should one side be able to combine in one attack? Right? That's hard to do. One battalion, pretty easy. 2 battalions, it's harder. 3, 4, 5, 6, really hard, right? So these are some of the things about doctrine and organization that when you're running a game, what you do for one faction in the game might be different than what you do for another faction. Great questions, thank you. Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir. Lieutenant Lieutenant Sims. So I have a quick question. Have you considered working with AI when MVP so that maybe be quicker and more gaming?
Yeah, so the question is on artificial intelligence and making wargaming quicker. So the first answer to your question is we are exploring and experimenting with artificial intelligence. Right now, to a limited degree, specifically at Marine Corps University, the initiative that we looked at for this academic year was AI support to planning. That the large language model AI to be able to take a number of doctrinal publications and information that was curated. Curated is the important word we're not using ChatGPT, taking all the real and fictional information in the world and using that to support planning. Because when you do that, you get false output from the AI, right? So what we've been looking at is taking information that is curated, so we have a specific body of information that we're looking at, and then the students can query that AI to help enable planning, and particularly with doctrinal publications, terms, and I would say it's at a very elementary level. From a wargaming standpoint, what I think offers particular value is the ability to take like a computer game and in the game log, let's use Command Professional Edition as an example. After you run a 24-hour turn, you have all this information that gets spit out by a computer. And what we have a hard time with is if we run a 24-hour turn, is then telling the story back to the players about what happened, right? Large language models can take a scenario log and distill it to summarize, okay, here's what happened in the last 24 hours. This ship got engaged by this many missiles, these many missiles hit, and the ship was sunk. This other ship was engaged at this time with this many missiles, and here's what happened. And AI can process that very quickly, whereas if humans are trying to decipher that, it's a challenge. So I think that AI offers multiple use cases of how it can enable games, from planning to the after action and playing back what happened. What I also think is an opportunity is a battle captain kind of mode where you're giving immediate situational awareness to a player. I liken this to Star Trek with Data, the character Data, right? He's on the bridge and he tells the captain, hey captain, you know, here's the odds of the outcome of this, or the threat has these capabilities that will be able to engage us in 3 minutes. So imagine as a naval captain, if you have an AI on the bridge that tells you in 5 minutes, this adversary ship's weapon systems will have you in their range in 5 minutes. Otherwise, you're relying on your ship crew to tell you that and have the awareness of when you're crossing those range lines and knowing it. If you have artificial intelligence that is maintaining situational awareness in real time, and if you have it programmed to tell you, hey, these are the things I want you to tell me when I'm under threat, when my weapon systems have the adversary range, That's all very useful, from wargaming to real life. So I think the bottom line on artificial intelligence is that it's early in development still. It demonstrates a lot of opportunity. It also has challenges. So I think we are in a stage of experimentation right now to really get the full benefit of artificial intelligence. But from a wargaming standpoint, I think the biggest impact it will have in the near future is that post-game analysis, to be able to sift through all the information coming out of a computer game, as an example, and rapidly present that back to you as something that makes sense for the story about what happened in the game. Sir.
Good morning, sir. Capitán de Corvela, Marco Velasco. We saw in your presentation that wargaming considers the fog of the war. But what about the friction? How does wargaming consider the friction of real world?
I love it. I love it. The dice. So this is where I will tell players, you know, some people, when we start rolling the dice in a game, people are like, what are we doing? It's 2024. Why are you rolling the dice, right? I think it's really important to a war game, and here's why. It's about probabilities, and it's about dealing with the low probability outcome. If we didn't include chance, then we would always use the most likely outcome. If we all agreed, hey, 80% chance this is going to happen, and we just relied on our judgment, then we would go with the 80% outcome, right? But when you roll dice, it forces you to deal with a low probability outcome. In fact, it might even be an extreme outcome, where the player did everything right, but they still failed. That's friction, right? It's chance and friction, and it's the story behind it. I've had players where when you roll a 1 in the game for OWS, it's never good, right? You failed. And I will generally consider that when you roll a 1, that's catastrophic failure. Now, the player, again, may have done everything right. They made the right decision, they had the right plan, they had the right intent, but they rolled the 1 on a 20-sided die. And I've seen players roll the 1 on a 20-sided die 2 times in a row, right? What happens to that player? They want to flip the table, right? They get frustrated. But this gets to the art of facilitation, where it goes right back to this question on friction and on probability and chance in war. That you may have done everything right, and it just doesn't go your way. So now what are you going to do? Do you repeat and set those conditions again and do it again? Or do you decide to do a different approach that may give you a higher probability of success? Or because you tip your hand to the enemy, you need to now do something different. The dice tell a story. And sometimes that story is that friction has happened. And that you don't get things going your way. And that's why I love including dice in the game and that probability outcome, because it forces you to deal with low probability outcomes that otherwise you would never explore. And you will then learn from that, and you will develop a new mental model based on a catastrophic outcome of what happens if everything fails. Now what do? You just developed a new mental model of what you will do in those conditions when everything goes wrong. So I think dice are really important to telling that story, and friction is really the key part of that. Sir.
Good morning, sir. Which method do you, in your experience, think is best for educational purposes, tabletop or computer? And the second question, which method do the new generation of wargame gamers prefer? Thank you.
Okay, really good question on which methodology is better for education. So, I think that if you pin me down, I'm going to tell you tabletop is better because it gives you that human interaction over a map with the conversation that happens and the situational awareness and the discussion over the factors that go into the outcomes, right? When you do all that in a computer, you short circuit that mental process and you may not see the why in terms of what happened. So I think fundamentally, for education, a tabletop in the classroom is the better approach. Now, having said that, we are using computer games extensively outside of the classroom. Okay, because now, with a computer game, while it may not be the best for a classroom setting, it is one of the only ways that I can give multiple reps and sets to our students, where they can now, on their own, go to a wargaming virtual gym and play games to develop mental models, where the setup time is near zero, and they can play their turns, engage in an opponent, and do that multiple times over time. And start generating the data. Going back to AI, imagine now if all of you had to play a specific wargame scenario. And you all played it. And then you were able to query the AI and say, hey, how did I do relative to everybody else's game? And maybe you did terrible, right? And they said you were in the bottom 5%. And now imagine the power of you as a student being able to say, well, show me how the top 10 did it. And that the computer could pull up and now show you what the moves were for the top 10 outcomes. And you could then compare what you did with what the top 10 did, right? And learn from that and go, oh, I see where I went wrong. This is the difference in going to a gym where you work out on your own and you get a rep and set in the gym, but you don't get anybody giving you feedback and telling you how you did. But there will come a day, we're not there yet, but I think in the next year or two, where we will be at Rainbow University, is we will be able to provide this kind of feedback to a student, where everybody is playing the same scenario, and now they can compare how they did with the other runs and learn from that. And I think there's tremendous educational value from that computer game experience that we would not have if we didn't have computers. So, what is the future? You asked, what is that next generation, and what does the younger generation of wargamers, what do they like and what do they want? I think there's an expectation that because of what artificial intelligence is doing in our society and data analytics and the power of data analytics, that when we match that up with computer games in particular, because computer games generate data. A tabletop game, it is really hard to generate data out of a tabletop game. It can be done, but it's very time consuming and meticulous. So I think there's an expectation that we're doing more computer games and AI-enabled games, but again, I'm an equal opportunity wargamer. There is power in the tabletop that I think the wargaming community made a mistake about 25 years ago when there was an assumption that computer wargaming was where it was at. That was the kind of wargaming we should be doing. There was an expectation that computer gaming was the way to the future. I think what we're learning now is that that was a false assumption. That as humans, and because of how adjudication is done in games, there is value in running a game on the tabletop. But I think we need to also leverage the value of what a computer game brings, especially coming in the future. So, computers allow us to tap into time outside the classroom. Tabletop, I think, is the best way in the classroom to generate learning. All right, we probably have time for one more. Sir.
Good morning, sir. Miguel.
Espérate el micrófono.
Good morning, sir. This is Miguel from the Coronel. I have one question related to the design process of your wargame. So, as a lead designer of the Operational Wargame System, I wanted to know what were some of the key challenges that you faced in designing the game and elaborate the adjudication process between all the ways forward, including that we have now the cyber warfare and the space warfare.
Yeah, great question. So, related to some of the design challenges of the operational wargame system, I would say our fundamental design challenge was speed of adjudication. When we started to try to find a wargame system, we looked at some commercial tabletop games. But what we found is that those games had a lot of combat charts, and it took us too long to adjudicate. So we needed to find a game system adjudication method that allowed us to speed our adjudication. One of the key things about the operational wargame system is most of the information that you need to adjudicate is on the counter. Where we had to deviate from that was in ground warfare. And that the ground warfare, because of terrain, because of flanks, for human factors, there was a lot of things with ground warfare that made it more complex. That we still have a combat chart to help us in ground warfare. But most of the naval warfare, you can just look at the counters and you know what die you're going to roll for the adjudication, and you modify that die based on the different factors that you see on the game table. So I think that the dice promotion system that is the core of OWS was the key thing that enabled success with that game system, because it gave us an adjudication method that allowed us to adjudicate more quickly. One of the other design challenges was space. So initially, space was one thing in the game. It was surveillance reconnaissance. That was it. I had an Air Force 3-star general that played our game, and he told me, he goes, "Tim, you've boiled space down to one thing." And he's like, he said, if he tried to do that with ground warfare, I would have significant objections to that degree of simplification. And he told me, he's like, I have objections to your simplification of space to simply surveillance and reconnaissance. It includes communications, command and control, position, navigation, and timing, All of those are different satellite constellations. So one of the challenges that we had in the game was coming up with the game mechanics that made all of those aspects of space matter in the game. And I think we've done a simple but good enough job of that in the game system. On cyber warfare, one of the things that I will tell players is that there are cards that come with the game that have specific cyber attacks that the players can leverage. But we only include in the game box about 8 cards with cyber attacks. All of those cyber attacks are degrade, disrupt. None of those are exploit, which is a different effect. So there are 2 aspects of the game where we heavily rely on the player creativity in getting the players to decide what effect they're trying to achieve. And then we have to apply some subject matter expert adjudication, really a seminar matrix game adjudication to decide how to apply the game. And that is with cyber and with soft. We don't want players to limit their thinking and to hand them a script of, okay, well, here are your 6 cyber actions. Pick what you want to do with cyber, right? We didn't want to limit that. Same thing with soft. We didn't want to limit player creativity with soft. So we tell players, hey, you decide what effects. You can use the tools that we've included in the game, but those are simply a guide to help you decide what we can do within the game system. But we want you, the player, to decide in the end what effect you want to achieve with soft and cyber, and then we creatively adjudicate that in the game system. The Admiral will like this one because submarines is frankly one of the hardest in the game to get the rules right. I would say that initially it was too easy to detect submarines in the game. And submarines were dying at a rapid rate in our game system because the signature was not, it was not hard, it was too easy to detect. So we've tried to get that right by adjusting some of the dice and signature values for submarines. The other gets into the submarine lethality and different views on how effective a submarine is in engaging multiple targets, for example. If you have a surface action group, how many ships can that submarine effectively engage, and how to adjudicate that submarine combat. I think submarines has been one that, frankly, continues to be a challenge. And stealth aircraft is another one, where too easy in the game to detect stealth aircraft in some circumstances. So trying to get the game dialed in on stealth aircraft. And then the other gets to this problem in the game system with air units. If you have fighter aircraft operating from a fixed installation, they're relatively easy to target. But most of the future warfighting concepts for Air Force units is the Agile Concept Employment, ACE. And so wrestling within the game of how do you model air unit employment when they're distributed across the battle space. They're in a smaller footprint. So what is the sortie generation? How effective or lethal is that squadron? That squadron is probably more lethal operating from a fixed installation, but it's less survivable. When you're operating in a distributed manner, now it's harder to detect. It's probably not as lethal as a lower sortie generation, but it's harder to detect and harder to kill. So getting some of these warfighting concepts modeled effectively in the game has been a design challenge. to try to get all these different aspects of modern warfare modeled in the game system. It's been a challenge. I would say it's okay, but this is where I emphasize that the game is semi-rigid. And the semi means you have to rely on subject matter expert opinion, professional judgment. That when something happens in the game and you're like, you know what, this just doesn't seem right, that you then feel comfortable to leverage the expert in the room to say, what do you think? You know, maybe it's a submarine engagement and we're not certain the impact of weather on the ability of that submarine to engage that surface ship. And maybe it's a 20-foot seas. And if the adjudicator doesn't know that, and the rules don't say it, what do? Well, if you have a submarine driver in the room, you go, hey, what do you think? And you get that integrated in the game. That's the important, that's why I say the semi-rigid aspect of the game is so much power, because it is, the battlefield is so complex that you cannot write a rule book for every situation. And so you have to empower the game adjudicator with an array of tools that help them adjudicate the complex battlefield. So I think the game has done a pretty good job of that, but we've discovered along the pathway some of those particularly challenging areas. All right, Admiral, how's that for time?
We have the last question.
All right, sir.
So, good morning, I'm from the Peruvian Army. I would like, first of all, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask you, how can we measure or how can we know that the decisions that we do during wargaming or the results are going to give us a good idea of the reality in the future?
So how do we know whether a war game's results are giving us an idea of the reality in the future? This goes back to the predictive question from before, where we never know for certain. And I think it's really important that we run games multiple times. When I was the wargaming director at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab, if we ran one game and we had insights from that game, the senior leaders that I would brief on the insights from that game, I would say were mildly interested in those insights. But if we ran 10 games with different players and we started to see consistent outcomes, then I would start to frame the insight in a degree of confidence. If we saw it 1 time out of 10, then that was a low probability outcome, low confidence. But if we saw something 10 out of 10 times, I can now start to say with high confidence that this is probably a good insight coming from the game, right? Because we have multiple data points that arrived at that same conclusion, and I can then have high confidence in the outcome. So I think iteration, the number of times that you run a game, is really important. And the more times you run a game and you start to see consistent outcomes, then your degree of confidence should go up. I think it's important to caveat this with the assumptions that go into the game. We may have some factor in the game that is completely wrong. I'll tell you one, I'll give you an example, okay, that is one that I see happening right now that I don't know the answer to, but has caused me to question all of the insights that emerged from the game previously, based on what we're seeing. And this relates to hypersonic missiles and air defense, right? We had an assumption before the Patriot systems went to Ukraine that we were operating in our unclassified games, that hypersonic munitions could not be engaged effectively by certain air defense systems, right? But what we're seeing happening in Ukraine is now challenging that assumption, and that perhaps the air defense systems are more effective in dealing with certain threats that are hypersonic. Just because it's hypersonic doesn't necessarily mean anymore that it cannot be engaged by today's air defense systems. That is something that by observing the battlefield today and what's happening in Ukraine, we're learning and seeing those interactions and questioning the assumptions that we previously made on adjudication. And so it's always important to go back and look at those design assumptions, particularly on different sensors and weapon systems, because we may have a whole series of games that the insights may be based on a false assumption. And we have to constantly question the assumptions and revalidate the assumptions that are going into the game design. And that's a constant in wargaming, right? You never arrive at a perfect state where your model is perfect. That doesn't happen. All models are wrong, but most are useful.
Thank you very much, Coronel. It was a pleasure to have here you at the Naval Academy. We appreciate your support and also all your things and thoughts about wargaming. That is a very important topic in military education. So, an applause to